Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. With the votes from the midterm elections still being counted in Florida and Georgia, and new claims of voter suppression, of votes not being counted, and arguments and accusations flying back and forth, I thought we really needed to dig into this topic right now. And thanks to my guest, Joshua Douglas, who teaches election law and voting rights at the University of Kentucky Law School, we have the perfect person to help us walk through these issues, not only to understand what he calls the doom and gloom of voter suppression, but also to tell us some stories of individuals who are actually making a difference to expand access to the polls, to lower the obstacles to the right to vote, the all-important right to vote. And he's written a book on this too, which he's going to tell you about, a fascinating book, an important look at this really vital issue. It's become a big issue in this election, and it will be a big issue over the next 2 years as we gear up for the 2020 presidential election. Stay tuned for an exciting episode of Good Law, Bad Law. Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. On this episode, as votes are being counted and recounted in Florida and in Georgia following the exciting midterm elections this month, it's important to talk about how we vote, how many of us vote, and how many of us don't get a chance to vote. And with me to explore that is one of the country's leading experts on election law and voting rights, Josh Douglas, who's a professor of law at the University of Kentucky Law School. So first of all, Josh, thanks so much for being on the program. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Josh, in addition to teaching in this area on election law and voting rights and other aspects of the voting process, has a new book out or coming out. You'll tell us, Josh, but it's called Vote for Us: How to Take Back Our Elections and Change the Future of Voting. So tell us about yourself, Josh, before we get into our topic today, your background, the areas that you cover in your practice and in your writings.
Great, thank you. As you mentioned, I'm a law professor at the University of Kentucky College of Law, and my specialty is election law and voting rights, although I teach some other courses as well. All of my scholarship and writing is on the areas of election law and voting rights. And my previous scholarship has looked at numerous areas involving the constitutional right to vote, voter ID issues, those sorts of things. But I'm really excited about my new book coming out, as you mentioned. It's coming out in the spring, although it's available already on Amazon for pre-order, and it's called Vote for Us: How to Take Back Our Elections and Change the Future of Voting. And this is a book for the general public. So although there's some law background, I really wrote this book to be accessible for the average layperson.
Right.
And what it does is tell stories of individuals who are working on positive changes to our democratic system and our election process. We hear so much doom and gloom about our elections. And you mentioned it even in the introduction, voter suppression, and how not everyone has an easy access to the ballot. And that's true, and there's been so much talk about that. And without minimizing the importance of those issues, this book takes a positive spin on things. It explores ways that we can improve turnout, improve participation, and the strategies that everyday individuals, I call them democracy champions, in the book are using to fix the system. And I find the stories, it was really inspiring when I was researching and writing, and I hope the book inspires others as well.
Well, and I'm sure, and I want to spend the second part of this episode talking about some of those stories that you describe in your book. But I don't think we can completely ignore the doom and gloom either, because we're still in the throes of the aftermath of what many called the most important midterm election in our lifetime. And I see those, the headlines and those descriptions, and then wait excitedly to see what the voter turnout levels are going to be. And they're still so pitifully low. It struck me after the 2016 election that nearly 100 million people didn't vote in that election. And here again, we're seeing that play out. And I've just always believed we should be doing everything possible to make sure everybody can vote. And yet still in this year, 2018, it seems like more and more obstacles are being thrown up in the way of people exercising one of the most fundamental rights we have as Americans. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what's going on in Florida and what we've heard has been going on in Georgia. Those are, I think, two very prominent examples where there are a lot of concerns about how the vote was carried out, concerns raised by both of the two major political parties. Maybe you could just help us understand where we are right now, just a week after the midterm elections.
Sure. So, you mentioned a lot of things that we would need to unpack in terms of the voter turnout. But I do agree, on the one hand, people are saying that turnout did surge in many places as compared to historical precedents. Yet overall turnout around the country for this midterm was about 50%. That is to say that half of the electorate didn't show up to vote for one reason or another, which we can explore in just a moment. But to me, that just does tell us that we have a fundamental problem with our democracy. When only half the people are showing up to elect our leaders, there's something wrong with saying that we truly live in a representative democracy. And we can be better, and we must. And so we can't, celebrate, even though turnout actually did go up in many places, we can't celebrate that as sufficient. Now, I think that the reason why you have low turnout is twofold. On the one hand, there's a lot of voter apathy. People feel like my vote won't matter. I don't really have a say. It doesn't matter which side wins. Right. And so we need to do something about the civics education in our country to explain why this actually does matter, and educate people about how their vote can make a difference. And then the second thing, as you mentioned, are structural hurdles to the ballot box for many people. In many places, voting is simply not that easy. I live in Kentucky. We have 1 day of voting, Election Day. The polls are open from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. If you aren't available on Election Day, you can vote absentee, but you have to give an excuse for getting an absentee ballot. And that's it, by and large. There's a couple other minor exceptions, but by and large, voting isn't that easy. And, perhaps no surprise that I waited almost an hour and a half to vote on Election Day. So there are a handful of structural barriers. So things like not having lots of access to polling places. Certainly voter ID laws present a kind of, I don't want to say voter suppression, but a hurdle for certain voters.
Making it more difficult, right? For some people.
For some people, and a lot of people listening to this podcast probably think, well, I have an ID in my pocket, and everyone I know does too. But lots of people who particularly live in inner cities or minorities, are poor, work 2 jobs, use public transportation, don't have a need for a driver's license, for example. And so, and then there's the registration hurdle as well, right? When many states have a requirement that you have to register 30 days before an election. This day and age, states don't need 30-day lead time between the registration deadline and Election Day to make sure their voter rolls are ready to go for Election Day. And yet, that 30-day requirement cuts a lot of people out of the process, because if you're not someone who pays close attention to politics, maybe you will in the weekend before Election Day, but if you hadn't registered a full month ahead of time, you simply can't vote.
And the argument, Josh, the argument against those kinds of measures, or say against allowing registration up to and even including Election Day itself, or the arguments for voter ID requirements, which many studies have shown disproportionately affect the elderly, minorities, low-income voters, is always fraud, the threat of fraud. But I think most studies that have been done, including President Trump's own commission, which was set up to try to look at the widespread fraud that he proclaimed was there in the 2016 election. Most of the studies show there is no fraud, or very, very, very little fraud, really.
There's very little fraud, and it's in isolated incidents, and typically in local elections. Certainly, a voter ID law doesn't root out any fraud that's in the system whatsoever. A voter ID requirement only can stop one kind of fraud. That's in-person impersonation. Someone showing up to the polls and pretending to be someone else. And that simply doesn't happen for a variety of reasons. But one is that it's a really horrible way to try to throw an election. You need to get a lot of people involved, and you're likely to get caught with the more people that you have in the scheme. Now, that's not to say there is zero fraud in the system. There's sometimes absentee balloting fraud. There's sometimes vote buying that occurs. Again, very isolated, though. And so we had this big mantra. It really started after the 2000 election. And it wasn't even Bush v. Gore, but it was the Senate election in Missouri that Mel Carnahan, who had died in a plane crash 2 weeks prior to Election Day, beat John Ashcroft.
Right.
And on election night, it was the other Missouri Senator, Kit Bond, at the Ashcroft Watch Party, who was banging the podium and saying, "Dogs and dead people through this election." And that created that along with Bush v. Gore created this frenzy, particularly among Republicans, that voter fraud was widespread, and it used it to justify various, suppression tactics or stricter election laws. Now, of course, the mantra of voter fraud has been around for a long time. It's, the concern of it is what led to restrictions like the secret ballot, not restrictions, but rules like the secret ballot, over a century ago. So that's not to say this is a new thing, but certainly in the modern era, it's become much more widespread with really little evidence whatsoever to support it. And yet it gets into the public consciousness, and people think, my elections are horrible and infected with fraud, largely through anecdotes. When you talk to people and they say, "Oh, I know there's lots of fraud." And I'll say, "Well, what do you know?" And say, "Well, my friend has said this. My friend has said that." But as you noted, all of the academic studies to look at this have concluded that fraud is very, very minimal.
Well, and we had that in Pennsylvania. The legislature passed a voter ID law. I think it was in 2014 or thereabouts, and there was a whole trial where the proponents of the voter ID law had to come forth with evidence to show that there was fraud as a basis for this requirement. And the court ended up throwing out the case because there was no such evidence.
Yeah, it did. And that case is interesting because it contrasts with a case out of Indiana that went to the U.S. Supreme Court, in which the U.S. Supreme Court essentially told the state, you don't need to show detailed evidence of fraud to justify your law. You can just say you're worried about it. And the Pennsylvania courts, correctly in my view, used the Pennsylvania Constitution, the state constitution, to say, no, the state's got a higher burden. If it wants to pass a law that has the effect of disenfranchising valid voters, of course, you need to minimize that, but also to justify the law, you need to have better evidence. And so what we've seen is some state courts have used their state constitutions. This is something that I've written a lot about, actually, in my legal scholarship, to say that the right to vote it should be protected more broadly under the state constitution than it is under the federal constitution.
Well, what about the early voting? You mentioned that your state of Kentucky doesn't have early voting. I know a lot of states have moved to early voting, but then in some states there were subsequent moves to cut back. In other words, they might have had, and I'm making this up, but just to illustrate, perhaps they passed a law that said you have a month of early voting, and then another governor takes office and says, no, we're only going to allow a week of early voting. Why wouldn't we allow that? Because that doesn't implicate the fraud argument. It just opens the doors more widely to allow more people to get in to vote.
So early voting really started after the 2004 election, and Ohio was one of the first places that pushed this more strongly, because the lines during the 2004 presidential election in Ohio were massively long. People were waiting throughout the night in some places in Ohio. So the Ohio legislature, bipartisan, passed early voting for the 2006 election. And then it turned out that it was actually Democrats that tended to use early voting more. particularly African Americans, would do what they refer to as souls to the polls drives, where
Mm-hmm.
they bring buses to churches and they
Right.
bring churchgoers to the polls after church on Sundays. And so it was the Republican-controlled legislature in Ohio that then cut back. So, one might say, well, there's a political reason for that. To give those who oppose early voting their sort of their best argument. I think there's two reasons why you might want to pull back on early voting. One is that studies have actually shown that early voting by itself hasn't improved turnout, at least not yet.
Mm.
What it's done is it's time displaced the voters who are already likely to go on election day are just going earlier instead. And
Okay.
so the argument might be, well, what's the benefit? Especially because it's costly, at least it costs some money to have early voting sites. The other argument I've heard is that the election day is sort of the collective wisdom of the electorate all geared up to one day. And so, if you vote 3 weeks early and things change, maybe you would have voted a different way. Or, it's better to have all the focus on one day. My book doesn't have a chapter on early voting. It talks about a lot of positive reforms to improve our election system. I decided not to devote a chapter to early voting because the studies haven't shown yet that it's improved turnout, although I do think it reduces lines on election day. But I think
Yeah.
there are better ways that some states have adopted, better mechanisms that some states have adopted, such as universal vote by mail, where every eligible elector, every voter is sent automatically a ballot in the mail to return either via Dropbox or through the postal service. And so there's essentially no in-person voting. Or Colorado has kind of a hybrid system where they have, if you wanted to do in-person voting, you could as well. But in any event, there are different ways to do it. Early voting, I think, is on balance probably a positive reform. It's surprising to me that the turnout numbers haven't increased in the states that have done it. I do think, again, that it certainly reduces the lines on election day itself. But I think there are even better reforms that we could adopt.
Okay, so now you've opened the door, and now I'm going to walk through it. You've got this book that focuses on these positive steps that are already being taken in some parts of the country, and you're urging that that people need to expand those efforts. So uh, one idea you've already shared is the idea of mailing in votes, that everybody would do that. What are some, as you did your research for the book and talk to people who are out there trying to open the doors more widely, and also trying to fight against the hurdles that get put in place of people's right to vote? What are some of the other measures that you found could be successful in improving the situation?
Well, I put it into essentially three different buckets. Who can vote, sort of who's in the eligible electorate, structural things about the voting process, election day itself, making election day more convenient, and then the third being even broader structural things about our governmental system, like gerrymandering and public finance.
Hmm.
So I'll talk about each one very briefly,
Okay.
and then we can go into some more details. So on the who can vote aspect of the eligible electorate, some places are doing some innovative things, like there are some cities that have lowered the voting age to 16 for local elections and coupled that with improved civics education in high schools. Tacoma Park, Maryland was the first place to do that, and now it's spread to a handful of other places in Maryland. And in fact, Washington, D.C. is about to pass a law that will lower the voting age in the district's elections as
Wow.
well. And the
Interesting.
studies have shown that improves turnout. The turnout among 16 and 17-year-olds is often about double that of the rest of the electorate. And psychological studies show that 16-year-olds are actually capable of what psychologists refer to as cold cognition, or the ability to make reasoned judgments and decisions. So by lowering the voting age and then coupling it with much more meaningful civics education, we can create a whole new generation of engaged habitual voters. The other eligibility aspect I think is interesting is the reenfranchisement of felons.
Yeah.
We just saw Florida voters passed a state constitutional amendment that reenfranchises over 1.4 million former felons. And there are other places that have had, not as widespread, but still some smaller successes. Actually, opened the book with a kind of surprising story from my own state of Kentucky, where even though Kentucky has one of the worst felon disenfranchisement laws in the country, in that it disenfranchises people for life, the legislature was convinced to ease the law just ever so slightly because of the advocacy of someone named Wes Powell, who spoke up and told his story.
Right. And you tell his story in some detail in your book, I know.
Yeah, and it's really interesting and inspiring, how he, stood up and just started to, talk about how he had made a mistake 20 years prior, and he had cleaned up his life, and he had gotten married and had a family and had a steady job, and yet he couldn't vote because Kentucky disenfranchises people for life. And that convinced the Republican head of the Senate Judiciary Committee in Kentucky, and then that Republican convinced his fellow Republicans to enact a law that allowed this guy, Wes Powell, to get an expungement of his record. And then Wes has been a habitual voter, a regular voter in every election since.
Right. Great story.
On the election day, making things more convenient. Again, all of these in the book, I tell stories about the people who are involved in making these reforms. So I really like the story I tell about this guy named Scott Doyle in Colorado, who became the head of elections of Larimer County, Colorado. And he noticed that it was actually election day 2000 when he noticed that some people were turned away from their polling place because they simply had gone to the wrong polling place, didn't know where they needed to go,
Right.
and then showed up to their correct one, but were turned away because the polls had closed at that point. And he thought to himself, there's got to be a better way. So he took a pen and a paper out, and he started sketching out models of voting and realized that a vote center system could work, where you can show up anywhere in the county to vote. You don't have to go to your home-based precinct where you're assigned, but they're all electronically connected. And so if you're closer to home or closer to work, you can go to the vote center near you. And they enacted that. And so Colorado has, as I kind of mentioned, sort of a hybrid system where every voter is mailed a ballot that they can fill out at home, educating themselves, then either drop it off or mail it in. Or if you want to vote in person on election day, you can go to any of the vote centers in your county, and it doesn't matter which one you go to, and vote. So that's sort of the ultimate inconvenience. And again, they've put in fail-safe mechanisms to ensure the integrity of the system as well.
Mm-hmm.
There's a handful of other similar examples, things about voter registration. But one of the most compelling policy arguments in favor of these reforms is that the states with the highest turnout in the past elections have had eased registration rules like same-day registration or automatic registration, which is sweeping the country, and or policies like universal vote by mail. So we can actually see that these things work.
They're tied. They're actually tied to greater voter turnout.
Yeah, they are. And the elections in those states weren't like the battleground states. I mean, Minnesota had a very high turnout in 2016. It wasn't a battleground state for the presidential election, but it has same-day registration. So that voter who's only starting to pay attention the weekend before can go to the polls and register and vote at the same time. And then I'll mention briefly the third sort of category I said about kind of broader structural, and then we can get into some details if you'd like. But things like gerrymandering and campaign finance reform. So after the 2016 election, a woman in Michigan named Katie Fahey posted on Facebook and said, "I'm thinking of taking on gerrymandering in Michigan. Anyone want to join in?" And she was shocked when hundreds and then thousands of people responded. Wow. And it turned into a large grassroots organization that they called Voters Not Politicians. And they gathered signatures. They gathered thousands and thousands of signatures, all through volunteers, and got a ballot measure on the ballot for this past election to amend the state constitution and take redistricting, the process of drawing lines, away from self-interested politicians and place it with an independent commission. And the voters passed it just a little over a week ago. So it's just a great story about how one person created a movement to take on the political establishment, and those who drew the line, and you see these strange shapes that you know how they're going to perform. And now Michigan's going to have an independent redistricting commission, thanks to her and her fellow volunteers' work.
Incredible. That was the initiative just passed on the Michigan statewide ballot this year. Yeah, that's incredible. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, so we had
Well,
a 2 year process essentially. She posted it on the day after the 2016 election, and she was working at a different job, and she was working for the Michigan Recycling Coalition and stayed on that job for a while. I think just earlier in 2018, she finally devoted her full time attention to voters, not politicians. But this shows that everyday people, everyday ordinary Americans, can do extraordinary things to change the process in their own communities. And the same thing goes with public financing. So Maine has been very successful with its public financing system, and largely it is thanks to people like a woman I profile in the book named Alice Smith, a stay-at-home mom who decided to take on public financing and campaign finance as her issue and became a primary spokesperson for the cause. So, I think the message is state and local reforms can make a difference. A lot of these things have started at the grassroots level in the local communities, and that it's everyday Americans who have the power to convince their fellow citizens that these reforms are really worthwhile and can actually make a difference. Now, again, we have to fight things like voter suppression. We saw in North Dakota this past election a voter ID law that
right.
impacted Native Americans. We see the recounts, as you mentioned earlier, going on in Florida and Georgia amidst a bunch of voter suppression. You see things like the Secretary of State of Georgia, who runs the state's elections, is also the candidate for governor. And so he's making rules that impact his own election. These are all things that we need to worry about. But if we're only worried about voter suppression, then I think that's half the battle. We certainly have to do that. But if we do only that, we're kind of playing whack-a-mole against the latest abuse. We can also go a lot further if we focus on positive enhancements as well.
Well, that also brings me to one of the things I'd wanted to ask you about, which is, it's my understanding, and correct me if I'm mistaken on this, that although it hasn't been done, the federal government could set federal standards for voting. Instead, there's been a sort of passive decision or a tacit decision to leave it to the states individually to set their own voting structures and rules and regulations. But the federal government could, under the Constitution, set a national standard and a national framework. Do you think that should happen, and would that be a good thing?
Well, the federal government could certainly set national rules for federal elections, and then states could decide to comport with those and run the state elections on the same day. What the Constitution says is that the time, place, and manner of holding elections shall be directed by the states unless Congress decides to jump in, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
So Congress can override any state laws, and it has in some circumstances. The Voting Rights Act mandated national rules with respect to not suppression to votes of minority voters. The National Voter Registration Act, also known as Motor Voter, set uniform standards, nationwide standards for voter registration. I think two things. One, the likelihood of Congress enacting new rules maybe got a little bit better with the Democrats taking over the House, and they've said that voting rights is going to be one of their primary things that they focus on to begin. Of course, they have to get bipartisan agreement for any rules. There's also something to say, though, however, for local experimentation. You think of the butterfly ballot in Florida in the 2000 election, and apparently there was a ballot defect in Broward County this year, which may have caused some people not to vote in the Senate race. What if the federal government had mandated a certain ballot design that was flawed that then was used nationwide? So I think there are some virtues for local experimentation. I wouldn't say that Congress necessarily right now should lower the voting age to 16 for all elections. Let's see how it works in the localities that have done it. I'm pretty excited and positive about the reform based on what's happened so far. But I think there is some merit to having local control and local experimentation. Of course, there's got to be a baseline. And so when you have suppression of valid votes, then that is the sort of area where I think Congress can do some good.
Well, and there are in the law so many examples on the other side, examples where the government leads and the states follow, or examples where the states, are the innovators and the federal government plays catch up eventually. And it sounds like you're saying there are good arguments for letting some of the innovations that are playing out in different states, even in smaller subsets of states, communities, letting those innovations play out and see how those might work and which ones do work well, and hope that they catch on.
Yeah, and I'd say that, some voter expansions have started at the local and state level and then gone national. I'm thinking of things like women's suffrage. There are a handful of localities and states that allowed women to vote in either all elections or just school board elections before finally the 19th Amendment did that nationwide. Now, certainly it would have been better just to do it all at once for everyone as early as possible. But to get buy-in, I think sometimes you need some of those local victories. Now, of course, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 greatly expanded the ability of minorities to vote, and it's not clear that the localities would have done that on their own. So I think there's good circumstances for starting at a grassroots local level, or going through a top down if you can get the top down to actually succeed. I guess what I'm saying is often local experimentation can help get buy-in for what might seem like a radical or a different way of doing things. And then once a handful of places do it, then you'll see more and more widespread growth. Another good example is ranked choice voting, a different voting mechanism. Instead of voting for one person, voters can rank order the candidates in order of preference. And then there's a counting system essentially that gives you a better overall sense of the electorate. Well, that started in San Francisco in early 2000s, then spread to a couple other places. And then this past election, Maine used it for their congressional elections, including the statewide Senate race. So that's another good example where a local innovation in how we vote has spread now to a full statewide election. I would suspect, voters generally love the system of ranked choice voting, and I would think that it might expand even further.
I guess that would be a system that would also reduce the risk of having to go through a runoff, because you would essentially be building the runoff into the first round vote.
That's exactly right. And we have a runoff going on in Mississippi for the U.S. Senate, and I know we might have a runoff in Georgia for governor, depending on how that recount plays out. And the runoffs, generally speaking, tend to be much lower turnout as a general matter. And so ranked choice voting collapses that into one, gives people the ability to have a say in giving their preference in terms of their order, and then improves turnout overall. Also, the other interesting thing that ranked choice voting does is it reduces negative ads, because candidates, if you're talking to a voter who supports your opponent as number one, you still want their number two choice, as opposed to having them rank you lower. So you're less likely to throw mud at your opponent. And that's exactly what, Minneapolis uses it for their mayor election. And it's exactly what a lot of the candidates had said that ranked choice voting did for them as well. And in fact, the Academy Awards uses ranked choice voting to select the Best Picture winner.
Wow. I did not know that.
It's already being used in even non-electoral places.
Well, Josh, I know your time is limited, but I have to ask you about one last subject. And of course, we do have these unresolved elections in Florida and in Georgia, and there is a racial component to both in both instances. You have a Black Democratic candidate for governor who's running currently behind. You mentioned the Republican candidate in Georgia, who was the Secretary of State in charge of the elections and is running somewhat ahead in the current tallying. But there's all kinds of allegations of voters having been suppressed there. Not touting Oprah, but she did give a very powerful speech in support of the Democratic candidate there, and talked in that speech about urging people to remember the sacrifices their parents and grandparents made, some of them dying in the fight to overcome obstacles put in front of literally in front of the polling places. a generation or two ago. What are some of the positive things you think can be done and need to be done to address some of those deeply entrenched, not just a part of history, but a part of our present too, types of suppression that disproportionately affect those who historically were kept from the polls?
So a great example, I think, and you're right. There's certainly a racial component in both recounts that are going on in Georgia and Florida. And if felons had been able to vote, had been able to regain their rights back in Florida, I bet you we wouldn't be in the recount situation that we're in. We're reenfranchising 1.4 million individuals in that state, and in Georgia, allegations of voter registration issues and whatnot. This is where I think boots on the ground really can make a difference. And so I point to some stories I tell in the book about individuals who are quite literally re-enfranchising or enfranchising people by getting them IDs. So voter ID laws, as much as I think they're not worth a while in terms of combating any existing fraud, are likely here to stay. And so advocates of voting rights need to find a way to make sure that those laws don't disenfranchise people. And so there's a couple of groups that I talk about. One's called Vote Riders, and the others called Spread the Vote, where they're actually working in communities in numerous states to bring people to the DMV to get them the ID, to work with them to figure out what underlying documentation they need. Some people, you need a birth certificate, but you were born in a different state. You need to get that birth certificate if you don't have a copy of it. So I talk about people like Molly McGrath and Kat Calvin, who are working with these for these different organizations. Kat actually started Spread the Vote, and they're working in minority communities and doing essentially voter registration drives, but they're voter ID drives where they're figuring out who doesn't have an ID. And this has the benefit of both getting them IDs, which can help them in their everyday lives. I didn't know this before I researched the book, but if you don't have an ID, it's often hard to get and go into a shelter or go to a food pantry. So it helps in their daily lives. And then it also encourages them to participate in our democracy. And so I think, again, it's all about boots on the ground, community, grassroots work that can enfranchise people, one voter at a time.
Well, and I just, as we're wrapping up, I have to put my vote in favor of young people too, because they're not burdened with that history. I don't think they see color the same way. I don't think they see differences the same way, and I think they have to and are. My middle daughter, Olivia, was registering voters all summer and all this fall in Pennsylvania. I think young people becoming engaged in the process. I love the idea of the example you gave of some places that have lowered the voting age to 16. Getting young people energized and involved and working on this issue, I think that's just going to be so important in what happens over the next 2 years till the next election and beyond. So here we are watching the votes being counted and hoping that everything turns out okay, however the votes come out. But I know there's an awful lot in your book, Josh, that you've given us just a taste of, and I want to encourage people to take a look at it. You can get it on Amazon now. It's again called Vote for Us: How to Take Back Our Elections and Change the Future of Voting. Josh Douglas from the University of Kentucky School of Law. Thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law. I really, really appreciate it very much.
Thanks. This was fun.